I've been getting really into the PlayStation 1 library as of late. It was a console I never really got to experience growing up, and considering a lot of my favorite series like Crash Bandicoot, Silent Hill, and the Biohazard/Resident Evil games got their start on the system, I figured I should give the wider library of PlayStation games a deeper look. One of the first games I chose for his little personal deep dive was Xenogears. Similar to the other series I just mentioned, Xenogears is technically the starting point for what is probably my favorite game series of all time, Xenoblade Chronicles. The Xenoblade series is very near and dear to me, and I'll inevitably talk about it on the show at some point, but when I started looking into the PlayStation, I ended up hearing about the previous attempts at starting a series from the director and main writer of the Xenoblade games, Tetsuya Takahashi. Xenogears was Takahashi's directorial debut. It's a game that was born from a story draft originally made for Final Fantasy VII that Square Enix rejected due to it being too dark. The project was then relegated to being a sequel to Chrono Trigger before being retooled and eventually becoming its own thing altogether with the working title of Project Noah. Project Noah eventually got retitled into Xenogears and ended up as the game we know it as today. It's interesting to me how this game kinda got shuffled around between Square Enix's other series before just ending up as its own thing entirely. Well, I guess it was just Squaresoft at the time, but you kinda get what I mean. Not really sure if this speaks more towards the ambition of the team behind Project Noah or Square's whole weird approach to developing games, but it's cool regardless that it became its own thing and survived. So with all that out of the way, why don't we actually talk about the game Xenogears itself. I will warn there's going to be a lot of spoilers talked about and shown in this video, so if you have any interest in this game and like going into things relatively blind, I'd heavily recommend clicking off and actually playing it first. Another thing to note is that when I was recording the footage I needed for this video, around 80% of the video files got corrupted due to an issue with the HDMI upscaler I was using to display my PS2 on my TV. So due to that, I'm going to be using footage from the Innocent Sinful's long play of the game for the parts that I lost the footage for, which was, most of it. Footage from their channel will be marked with a watermark like it has been up to this point in this video so far, and I will link to them down below. Go check them out. They do a ton of long plays of games without commentary, which is great for when you want to see a bit of a game to gauge your interest in it without having someone talk over it, and also just if you want to see a playthrough of a game that you can't really afford or don't have the interest in actually playing yourself. Anyway, with all that done, I'm Jay, and let's talk about Xenogears. First things first, let's go over my favorite part of Xenogears, the story and characters. So normally this is where I'd summarize the plot and then give my thoughts over it, but due to the fact that this game is extremely long, I'm going to just give a brief little explanation of some key points, and then go into talking about each of the main party members' story arcs. I would love to gush about every little detail of the plot, but I know myself a little too well for that and know we'll be here for 3 hours if I do. And while it does sound kind of fun, I'm not quite ready to be that kind of YouTuber just yet. I figured that covering the characters would be enough since their plot points comprise a lot of major story beats about the game, and in my opinion they are also the heart of this game, so I feel like it's kind of important to go over them specifically. But hey, who knows, if there's enough demand for it, maybe I'll make a video going into intense detail about the story. Anyway, let's get on to those key points I mentioned. Xenogears starts by telling us of the century-spanning war between the two nations of Ava and Kislev. Both nations are armed with giant mechs known as gears that have been excavated from ruins and restored by a religious organization known as the Ethos. With the game establishing the setting, we get introduced to the plot proper as well as our main character, Fei Fong Wan, a young man who was adopted into this small village. After a major tragedy caused by the war going on causes Faye to set out on his own, a force lurking in the shadows known as Graph pushes to get Faye involved in the war and to, kill God. Normal stuff. With the people Faye meets along the way, he tries to put a stop to the Forever War and free the world from its common enemy, Solaris. Solaris are basically a shadowy group of ancient people who think they know the best for the world and try to steer it in the direction that most benefits them and no one else. Think of them like the US Congress. The main party is also being chased by a few different figures throughout the game, namely Ramses and the Elements, who are an elite force of Solaris soldiers, and then also Graph and another mysterious force named Id. Throughout the game, the party also comes across improved versions of their gears known as Omni Gears, which are gears that have had their true powers unlocked by relics connected to the Zohar, which is an object that was brought to the planet on a spaceship that also brought the first humans to it. The final antagonist of this game, named Deuce, was also born from the Zohar. Alright, that seems like every detail that I need to go over to talk about the main party without any confusion. There's way more to the story than what I've already talked about, however, and I've unfortunately skipped a lot in favor of saving time, so I would really recommend checking it out for yourself if you get the chance to. My little tidbits of what I'm about to talk about with the characters cannot match up to seeing what this game actually is like. It was an unforgettable experience for me, and I hope it is for whoever decides to actually end up playing it. And with that, let's talk about the main party and their stories. Following Faye on his journey, we have Ceton, Ellie, Bart, Rico, Billy, Choo Choo, Maria, and Emeralda. Let's start with Ceton, the doctor of Faye's village. Well, Kinda. He's actually a former elite soldier of Solaris who deserted after he fell in love with the daughter of a general that led an army opposing Solaris. Citan keeps an eye on Faye more or less throughout the game and is constantly doing his best to keep him out of danger. Citan is interesting to me because he basically is allergic to revealing anything about his past, and a lot of his arc in this game is dealing with the effects of what he's done and been doing. A lot of his scenes and character moments revolve around his affiliation with Solaris, and he is the primary way we get exposition about them throughout the game. He's a fascinating character to me, and I think with how he's used as both a mentor figure and someone who can't super be trusted, makes for a fun juxtaposition that I enjoyed when played against scenes of Faye questioning himself throughout the game. When it comes to gameplay though, Citan is basically a must-have choice for most of the game. Not only is he insanely fast and can dish out a ton of damage, but he can also heal party members using one of his abilities. He's an extremely versatile party member and is generally one of the better options to keep on you for most of the game. Overall, Citan is pretty cool, though I kept most of what I find super interesting about him out of this review since I think it'd be more interesting to see for yourself. Kind of a cop-out, I know, but it's hard to talk about him without spoiling some stuff I'm going to talk about later. And also, hey, just because I said there'd be spoilers doesn't mean I'm going to spoil every interesting thing about the game. Next up is Ellie, another soldier from Solaris, but this one doesn't fully join us till a while into the game. She is introduced early though, where she meets Faye and Citan after she crash lands her gear in the forest right outside Faye's village. She later clashes with the group a few times before eventually defecting from Solaris to help the party save the Kislev capital from essentially being nuked by Solaris. She later gets stranded with Faye after their gears get shot down and the two of them grow close. Ellie is a character whose arc gets closely intertwined with Faye's after she permanently joins the party, and those two character stories are basically inseparable from this point on. Despite this though, she still has a strong personality and has her own character growth of figuring out who she wants to be without being under the thumb of Solaris, has some good conflict regarding her parents when they do go back to Solaris within the story, and honestly it's just interesting how we see her arc play out against Citan's, with both of them having the same origin of leaving Solaris, but with Ellie's defection happening in real time, while Citan's is mainly focused on flashbacks and through his vague statements. It's really interesting to compare the two, and who knows, maybe I'll do a bigger deep dive into their arc specifically at a later date when I'm talking about the story more. There's a lot of fun parallels there. In terms of her fighting ability though, Ellie is basically the black mage of the party. She excels at ether attacks, which are this game's form of magic attacks, and with certain item combos can become one of the most broken fighters in the game with her gear. She's fascinating and I love what the game does with her, but we'll talk about her more when we get to Faye, since again their character arcs are insanely intertwined. That brings us to Bart, who's the best character in the game bar none. Like, it's not even close. I love this insane little gremlin. Bart's a leader of a group of sand pirates and a pilot of the Yggdrasil, a giant ship that can travel over anything. He's loud, abrasive, and impulsive as all hell. But despite all that, he still has a heart of gold and ultimately just wants what's best for everyone around him. He's also actually the Prince of Ava, or was until his family got overthrown by a Solaris agent and the kingdom that was pulling away from war suddenly went full force back into it. Through the party's adventures through the game, they eventually free Ava from Solaris and Bart takes the crown as king for all of 30 seconds, and then he immediately ends the monarchy and makes the country a republic without a second thought, which is insanely cool and it's generally not something I've seen in stories involving monarchies. Really love this plot point and how it shows the integrity of Bart's character. His integrity and genuine good heart of his is reinforced constantly throughout the game, and even though all this terrible stuff the group goes through happens, he doesn't lose that spirit. He sees the worst of humanity throughout the story and he just keeps fighting for what's best for everyone. Moving on to gameplay though, Bart is generally used for status effects and elemental damage. He's not the fastest or the best damage dealer, but the effects and elements more than make up for it by being able to add new angles for you to fight from. Like I said at the beginning of this part, he's easily my favorite party member, and I love almost any scene he's in. He's far and away the most interesting character in the game in my opinion. Next up is Rico, a prisoner of Kislev's empire that is used primarily as an arena fighter with his gear in order to entertain the elite of the empire. Rico actually is the prince of the empire, born to the emperor and his wife. Due to his genetic differences though, he was cast out and basically thrown to the wolves after his mother died when he was 10. His father pretends he doesn't exist and just refuses to acknowledge him at all. He fights for the people held captive by the empire and works as the de facto boss of the prison camp, trying to keep people in line and keep them safe from the empire and outside forces when they come into the prison. Oh, he also really wants to commit patricide against his dad for what happened to him and his mom. Rico is really cool in my opinion and has one of my favorite sections of the game story-wise dedicated to him. Unfortunately, he just kind of stops being relevant after his section. It's weird. He has optional party member syndrome, which is where characters stop being relevant plot-wise because the devs had to account for them not being there, despite being a character you 100% have to run into and get into your party. I think he was supposed to get more later on based on some of the scenes we have in Act 2, but we'll get into that a bit later. Gameplay-wise, he's more of a slow and steady kind of character, dealing high damage numbers, not being able to get as many actions as fast as everyone else. Overall, I like him, not on one of my favorite party members, but I also think he just wasn't given enough time as an important part of the narrative in order to really hit his full potential as a character. Following Rico, Billy joined the party. Now purely from a conceptual standpoint, I adore Billy. I don't know why, but Magic Gun Priest is just a concept that really speaks to me. Beyond the fun character concept, Billy is probably one of the more multifaceted characters in the game. The way his cold and kind of cynical personality plays off Bart's is great, and they form a great two sides of the same coin kind of dynamic that I love whenever they're in a scene together. Outside that, Billy is a priest of the Ethos, the religious organization I mentioned earlier. A large part of his arc is finding out that the organization he dedicated his life to in order to help out as many people as possible actually just kind of sucks, like a lot, to the point where they're actively super evil and helping fuel the war that has ravaged the world for centuries. He has to balance the revelation with his feelings about his father, who left the same religion years ago, abandoning Billy and his little sister in the process. Finding out that his deadbeat dad was right and having to balance that against the years of negative feelings he has is really interesting to watch, and I loved how they handled him throughout the game with this arc. When it comes to gameplay, Billy is the party's white mage more or less, having the most buffs and healing spells. He has 3 separate guns that he can use that all do different levels of pretty decent damage. If you end up playing the game, I generally recommend having him around as well, since him having haste and healing is guaranteed to make a lot of fights easier. Really fun character overall. Holy Gun Twink is a good character archetype that more games should use. No notes beyond that, really. So if you've ever played a Xenoblade game before, you know what a Nopon is, and Choo Choo is basically the prototype Nopon of the group. With her race being called the Choo Choopalins, I don't know if I pronounced that right, and I'm not going to check because I don't know if anyone can pronounce that right. She fills the same role that the likes of Ricky or Tora do in the Xenoblade games, but without much going on character-wise. She kind of just exists as another party member, but there's a lot of lore attached to her, like how through her we learn that the other Choo Choopalins are all stuck on a floating city in the clouds named Shivat that is supposed to function as an arc of sorts for the species due to the main antagonist organization trying to wipe them all out a long time ago. Where Choo Choo gets really interesting is in a gameplay sense in my opinion. She's one of the 2 party members that don't have death blows, and which I'll explain in a minute, and also doesn't have her own gear. Instead she just grows to gear size and fights like normal. She's missing all the components of gear combat, which again we'll talk about later, and basically just functions how she would in her smaller form. But she's also the only character that can heal gears mid-fight, so she is pretty useful for actual gear combat. I unfortunately do not have much more to say about her since she's more of a side character than anything throughout the narrative. When she's used gameplay-wise, she's really capable, so that's neat. Maria is the daughter of a man that designs and builds gears, and she's been piloting them and using them since she was a small child. She's the defender of Shivat, using her special gear her father made to destroy any enemies that dare approach. In this story, Maria eventually has to defend Shivat from the horrible amalgamation of man and gear that Solaris has turned her father into. This plot point is really emotional and well written in a way that stood out in a game I already thought was super well written with a lot of really emotional plot points. Unfortunately, after this, she's kind of relegated to the background like Rico was. She's used more in the future than Rico is, but she's still kind of sidelined after she commits patricide. Anyway, there was supposed to be more for her story-wise, but we'll get into what happened to that a little later, kind of like the same with Rico. Gameplay-wise though, Maria is basically useless outside of her mech, with her only move that's actually worthwhile being calling in her gear to attack for her mid-battle. When she's in her gear though, she's up there as one of the strongest fighters in the game. I'll get more into human versus gear combat later, but Maria is a very situational character gameplay-wise due to the systems of the game, and it's super interesting how the game plays with this disparity using her. I like her as a character overall. Again, I just kind of wish she had more time to develop past the initial arc I described, like with Rico. Nearing the end of the pack, we have Emeralda, who's a colony of nanomachines built to function like a human. She's found in the ruins of an old laboratory halfway through the first disc of the game, where she immediately gets kidnapped by Solaris forces after we free her. We get her back eventually, and she takes a strong liking to Faye and Ellie. She later has a side quest you can do to get all of her memories back and unlock her true potential. Similar to Maria, not a lot to say about her due to a lot of her story not being in the game, but we'll circle back to that later. If you do the side quest to regain her memories, she becomes the strongest party member in the game by far, where she then gets even stronger due to the fact that on level up, all of her stats get bonuses instead of just some like they normally do when you level up. She becomes an absolute monster with a wide range of different abilities she can use in her human form, though I honestly can't comment on her gear form much because I never ended up actually using her in gear form in my playthrough. She's an interesting concept for a character, and what is there is really interesting and adds a lot of really interesting plot beats to the game. I just wish she was using the narrative more. That finally brings us to Faye. This time I saved him for last explicitly because I have the most to say about him. Faye is a character who I found to stand out amongst the ranks of other similar turn-based RPG protagonists. The way he changes and constantly adapts his worldview throughout the game is something interesting in that he feels far less static than most protagonists do to me. Not to say most turn-based RPG protagonists don't change, because that would be a bold-faced lie. I just find the way that Faye changes specifically to be extremely compelling in a way others weren't. For example, remember earlier when I said Faye got kicked out of his village due to the war? Yeah, that was actually Faye accidentally causing the death of his closest friends, and he has to carry that weight with him throughout the rest of the game. He's facing blame from both outside forces like the little brother of one of his dead friends, as well as inward blame from himself. He learns to handle these feelings of guilt without just getting over it or being absolved of what happened. He killed them, and that's not going to change, but he can. And he can use the mistake he made to go forward and try to prevent anyone else from making the same mistakes he did and try to keep people safe. I find characters like this fascinating, and the fact that we actually got something like that for the main character's game and so early on in the game is really cool to me. Another aspect of Faye that I want to touch on is also probably the most controversial aspect of him. and that's the fact that he has dissociative identity disorder. I wanted to talk about this specifically due to how the game handles it. Now, I've consulted with a friend of mine that actually has DID to kind of back up my words on this and to try to learn more about it before I spoke on it. So I'm hopefully not coming from a place of ignorance here, but also I don't have DID, so take my words with a grain of salt. I'm just going kind of off what my friend who I consulted with said. Remember that character I briefly mentioned earlier, Id, who is constantly following the party and showing up at times where Faye is absent in order to cause problems and fight wherever he can? Id and the gear he uses, that looks suspiciously like a bigger version of Faye's gear, it's just another personality of Faye. Id was formed when Faye had to watch his mother die in front of him at a young age. His mind couldn't handle the mental trauma and split into two separate identities, Id and another persona dubbed the Coward. The memories of Faye's life from before this moment were sealed in the back of his mind within the Coward, and Id was left to carry the burden of his mother's death and the feelings for it without any context or understanding of what led to it and what happened, which in turn created not only a strong sense of guilt in Id, who blamed himself for this, but a deep hatred for the world as well. Id was later sealed away when Faye got taken in by a village elder who managed to create Faye's new main personality, which is, the Faye we play as for most of the game. This is also how Faye ends up not having any memories from before his time in this village. Now, after checking with the person I know who has DID and doing some research myself, the conditions that led to Id forming the game is a way DID can form in real life as well. And a shield personality is something that can be formed when a split like this happens. The problem comes in with how Id is portrayed in the game. Id is violent and craves battle, which is reminiscent of a lot of really bad depictions of DID, such as 2016's Split by M. Night Shyamalan. However, when talking to my friend, this comes across a bit differently here due to what happens with the reveal. Despite Id being violent all the time, he generally only came out in moments where Faye felt powerless. Almost every time Id came out, despite becoming a problem for the party, he was there to help Faye protect his friends in some form. Even though Id would usually end up fighting them in some cases, he did show up initially to try to protect people. For example, Id showed up when Faye was unable to stop an advancing army that was going to kill people he was trying to protect. He emerged when Emeralda was getting kidnapped, and, there was a few more moments, but I feel it kind of gets the point across. This aspect of Faye was born as a way of coping with the death of his mother, and being born into an immediately violent situation shaped Id's view of how to handle these situations. The game also actually shows Id change and find peace once the Coward's memories are revealed to him and Faye, allowing the three of them to re-emerge and become whole again. To me, this is another interesting aspect that differentiates it a bit due to the fact that instead of just being treated as a violent monster, it is shown to be hurting just as much as the rest of Faye. He just lashed out because he couldn't handle the pain and didn't want to go through the same, experience of losing his mother again. That being said, it does still play into DID stereotypes to a degree, so it's not exactly perfect, and I'd say that it can come across really bad at times. I'd say that while this aspect of Faye's character isn't handled as well as it could have been, it's still probably one of the most nuanced takes on DID and larger scale media that I've seen. It's interesting to see how a game from 1998 did a lot better with this topic than media even today does, especially considering Hollywood still makes movies as early as 6 years ago that were not great about this topic. Anyway, the final aspect of Faye I want to talk about actually relates to Ellie. Earlier I mentioned her character becoming deeply tied to Faye, and that's because they literally are connected. Both Faye and Ellie are continually reincarnated specifically to fight Deuce, the final villain of the game that exists solely to take control of and exert its will over whatever planet it is sent to. This aspect of the story is super fascinating to me because of just how well all the clues are woven throughout the story. There are constant little nods to things from the past that point to Ellie and Faye having been there. Portraits of Ellie, people like Emeralda having a father and mother named Ellie and Kim that look just like Faye and Ellie. The list goes on. It's done in such a way where the player can easily put it together before the reveal, but it also places a huge sense of doubt over it and has a few other possible explanations sprinkled throughout the game as well that it could be. It's hard for me to get super in depth with this plot point without recounting a ton of the game and, spending more time than I already have on this section. But trust me when I say it's a masterfully done plot point. Oh god, wait, I haven't even talked about Faye gameplay wise yet, have I? Okay, so he's a pretty middle of the road fighter in terms of most of his stats, except for the fact that his combos tend to be the strongest in a game from what I noticed. Oh yeah, I said combos. We'll get to that soon. Don't worry. He's the main character, so he's built to be an all-around style of fighter, but give him the right items and know which combos to utilize, and he can still be really good for your team. Overall, I really like Faye as a character, and he may be one of my favorite protagonists in gaming. I could talk for hours about him and the rest of the cast, but to save your time and your ears, I'm just going to end this section with this. The reason I decided to dedicate this much time talking about the characters over recounting the plot is that I feel like the characters are kind of the core of Xenogears, like I mentioned earlier. Every Xeno game I've played so far has a cast of really strong characters, and this game is no exception. But here especially, especially I feel like getting to know the characters and see how they evolve and grow over the course of their story, hell, or even over the course of one scene, is easily the best part of the game, and I loved every moment we got with the cast. Even characters I didn't have the highest opinion of, like Rico, Maria, and Emeralda due to them not having a ton of screen time, are really strong during the parts of the game where they're actually used. The game focuses on these character arcs over the course of the game in a way that really makes them come to light, and I absolutely love that about this game. Up until Xenoblade 3 came out, this was my favorite party in any Xeno game, and even then, Xenoblade 3 just barely edges this game out in that regard. This game has my favorite story of any video game I've played, and if I could go through it all again blind, I would in a heartbeat. I don't think any game is going to match this experience for me, and playing this for the first time was something I will probably never forget. Speaking of playing, why don't we get to talking about the actual gameplay of Xenogears, since I've alluded to a fair bit of it throughout this section. The game uses traditional turn-based combat, but with what I felt like was a nice unique spin on it. That spin being the combo and death blow system. When you select attacks in this game, instead of just doing a little attack animation with nothing more to it like in most turn-based RPGs, you instead are given the option to select whether you do a light, medium, or heavy attack. Depending on what you choose, you then can use different combo trees that deplete an AP meter that refills every turn. After you've done these combos enough, you unlock death blows, which are finishers essentially. But that's not the only thing that can happen with this system. Some combos won't use up all the AP you have available each turn. That extra AP is then stored in a meter below your health that once you have built up enough points with it lets you just straight up perform several death blows in a row. I really like the system because while you do your big combos to rack up damage, you're also banking extra points in order to go in for big hits later and help put an end to the fight. Unless you're going for combos that use up all your AP every single turn, which is a viable tactic in its own right and still does great damage, it just doesn't feel as flashy in my opinion, and I kinda just like doing the big death blow thing more personally. On top of the AP death blow system, the game has a lot of familiar options available during normal combat like defending, using each character's magic equivalent, items, etc. The combo system is really where it's at, and it's the main focus of human combat though. I absolutely adore this system, and it's probably the most fun I've had with combat in a turn-based RPG. Like, in my opinion, this does a better job of keeping me engaged with the combat than using timed inputs, because I'm actively thinking about my combo routes and whether it'd be worth it to store AP for a big finish, or to just try and whittle the enemy down with stronger death blows in the moment instead of how some games will just have pressing the buttons again but at specific milliseconds this time. Now, this actually isn't the only combat system in the game. The gears have their own system for fighting that, while similar to how people fight, have a fundamental difference to them in the flow of combat. Since the gears are giant robots, they run on fuel, and certain actions take more fuel than others, so you have to maintain and keep track of your fuel over multiple fights. Certain actions end up costing more fuel than others, and there's even a system to make you move faster and do more each turn at the cost of extra fuel loss per turn. It's a neat risk-reward system that puts a bit of extra pressure on you during some of the longer strings of gear fights in the game. The light, medium, heavy style normal attacks for combat remain, but the way you work up to death blows is a little different. Basically, you use an attack and it charges your level meter, allowing you access to different tiers of death blow combos at different levels. Generally, the easiest way I found to charge a level meter is just to use heavy strikes and then go for whatever level of death blow you have unlocked at this point. Be careful though, like overdrive mode, using death blows and attacks use up more fuel, so you have to keep track of that as well on top of just everything else going on in a fight. While I do think the gear combat is interesting, I generally prefer the human combat over it. Something about the death blow system as humans just feels nicer to actually play and strategize around, whereas the gear system is less about strategy and building up for big death blow chains, and more just makes you manage your resources so your gear doesn't end up dead in the water. I still like the juxtaposition of the two styles though, and still had a good time with the number of gear bosses throughout the game. I just think I like the human combat a bit more for how much it shows up in the game. Outside of combat, the game's gameplay loop is more or less following a lot of traditions of the genre. You move around an overworld either by walking or via the various forms of the Yggdrasil. You go into dungeons and different important locations to complete story beats, you talk to people and do little puzzles in order to advance at times, and that's pretty much it. Oh, you can also jump whenever you want, which is pretty unique for other turn-based RPGs of the era. I wrote that into the script as a little joke, but as I got to thinking about it, it is interesting how this game having a jump button that you can use at any times does change the level design and make things more vertical. Like, it's a small thing that you wouldn't normally catch, but thinking about it now, that's actually pretty cool and led to a lot of neat, memorable levels, like that one cave leading up to a big encounter where you fought a ton of gears as Faye. Anyway, Xenogears still probably has the best turn-based combat I've ever used in a game. I think most people who enjoy this style of game would enjoy this spin on it. Even when you have to grind a bit, which never really happened often for me, it never feels too grueling due to the combat actually being really fun. But I'm probably extremely biased here because of, again, I really love how this game plays. It helps that the battle music for this game is pretty great also, so it never feels too stale when you're in a fight. Like all of the Xenoblade games, Xenogears has a great soundtrack. As I said previously, I'm not the best at judging music, but the score that Yasunori Mitsuda composed for this game is just completely incredible. I honestly really recommend you go listen to the songs Night of Fire, The One Who Bears Fangs of God, Treasure Which Cannot Be Stolen, and Small of Two Pieces, or as it's referred to in Japanese, Mobius. Huh, I wonder if that distinction is going to be important for any reason later. They're my personal favorites of the game, and I probably played a few of them in the background of this video, just to kind of give you a taste of what the soundtrack is like. Man, I wish I had a deeper understanding of music, just so that I could talk about these tracks more in depth. There's something about these songs in the game that just enraptures me in a way I feel like I should be able to describe, but just don't currently have the language for. So I'll just say that they're great songs that did a good job of hitting me emotionally, and I think that the way the game uses them is extremely effective. So as we're getting to the end of this review, I think it's time for me to finally address the elephant in the room that I mentioned I'd circle back to during the story section of this video. And that's the fact that this game is unfinished. Unfinished games are a thing that's always happened in the video game industry, despite what people nostalgic for when they were children say, and Xenogears is unfortunately one of those games. As far as I've been able to find, the team basically ran out of money after completing the first disc of the game, and were left with barely anything to finish the second half of the game with. The team behind the game didn't give up though, and did whatever they could to finish the game, which basically equates to it becoming almost entirely cutscenes or descriptions of long plot beats broken up by occasional dungeons or boss fights. A lot had to get cut, and what remained was basically a shell of what it was supposed to be. Things like Maria and Emeralda's Omnigears and their story beats were just completely erased because they didn't have time to include them with what was left. Which is unfortunate because, as I said earlier, those are two of the characters who could have really used some of the extra focus to make them feel more fleshed out. I have a bit of a controversial take on this section of the game, and it's that I think artistically it's really strong. I feel like the second disc has such a different vibe from how other games have handled losing their budget, and just in general makes the best of a bad situation. A friend of mine described the final disc as art house in an experimental sense, and honestly, I agree. It's not quite what the developers wanted, but they did what they could in unique ways in order to get as much of the game they wanted to make out there as possible. I'm usually of the mind that something not being extremely perfect doesn't make it inherently worse than something with insane polish, and I think the same applies here. Not to mention that in a thematic sense, I think the way the second disc was made works extremely well with what the game was going for. A big theme I took away from the game is continuing on in the face of adversity, with Faye and Ellie being continually reincarnated and tasked with taking out Deuce and the repeated struggles they go through over their various lives. They keep moving forward. Even when they stumble and want to quit, they get back up and keep going, either in the next life or in the one they're in. Several of the other party members have similar themes with their stories about not giving up and keeping things moving despite the troubles they faced. This game being finished by any means they possibly could in the face of a problem that has completely sunk other games or caused them to be released without an ending is a testament to the team behind Xenogears really wanting to get this out there in a way they could, and I respect it immensely. Xenogears is a game that is very near and dear to me, and it's probably my favorite game of all time at this point. And even if it's not exactly finished the way that developers would have liked it to be, I think the game's ending hours being the way that they are really adds something that makes the game special. Xenogears is by no means a perfect game, but it's one that's perfect for me, flaws and all. It's probably the game that's impacted me the most on a personal level, and I don't really know how to describe just how much this game meant to me having played it coming out of a really bad situation in my life only about a month before. I highly recommend anyone who has an interest in turn-based RPGs, and especially Xenoblade fans, to check this game out. Something that I think most people should get the chance to experience. It's unfortunately not super widely available due to Square Enix not putting it on anything more recent than the PS3 as of the time of me writing this, but emulators exist, and it's really easy to get all set up. Just if you have any interest in the game at all, please try it. Actually playing this game is going to be far, far better than me just describing it to you for 30 minutes. So with all that said, where do I put on the tier list? That's an easy answer, right at the top of S tier, where it's probably going to stay for this entire season, and probably as long as I review games, or even play games really. This is my favorite game of all time, and I just absolutely love everything about it. Don't have too much to add for this section, play it if you get a chance. It was truly an unforgettable experience for me that I would love to have more people see. I think I said that already last section, but I don't care, it bears repeating. And with that, that's all I really have to say about Xenogears. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Jay Talks About Game. I'm going to try to upload new episodes of this every other Friday, so stay tuned for that if you like this episode. Beyond that, there's a few more things going up here on Disc 3 that my friends and I have made, which I'll have links to on screen and in the description down below. Be sure to check those out if you enjoyed this, since everything else we're working on is pretty great as well in my opinion. We also stream regularly over at Twitch, so check us out there too as well. If you liked the video, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, since that's the only way for YouTube's algorithm to notice smaller channels. And yeah, that's basically it. I've been Jay, and thank you for listening to me ramble about my favorite game of all time. See y'all next time!